be leaving Egypt. It's good news. Psalm 40, verse 7. Here I am, I'm coming. In the scroll of a book, it is written about me. It's all about Yeshua. Isaiah 46:10, at the beginning I announce the end. Proclaim in advance things not yet done. Ecclesiastes 3:15, that which was is here already. That which will be has already been. It's recycled news. It goes all the way through the scriptures. And we see the Garden of Eden and the sacrifice for sin is played out in the Passover story. So we were talking about Moshe in the last teaching. And now we know Moshe was 80 years old when he saw the burning bush, right? Don't ever think at 80 years old that you're too old for your greatest commission from God. Don't ever think you're too old. Moshe had been commissioned by Adonai to return to Egypt to rescue the Israelites from slavery. Exodus 4:19-21. Adonai said to Moshe in Midian, "Go on back to Egypt, because all the men who wanted to kill you are dead." So Moshe took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started out for Egypt. Moshe took God's staff in his hand. Adonai said to Moshe, "When you get back to Egypt, make sure that you do before Pharaoh every one of the wonders I have enabled you to do." Moshe was warned, however, that there were obstacles ahead. Exodus 4:21-23. Nevertheless, I'm going to make Pharaoh hard-hearted, and he will refuse to let the people go. Then you are to tell Pharaoh, Adonai says, Israel is my firstborn son. I have told you to let my son go in order to worship me, but you have refused to let him go. Well then, I will kill your firstborn son. So this journey was about worship. It was about the freedom of worship. He told Pharaoh, I need to take my people out to worship me freely for 3 days, just 3 days. Now, in that day, Pharaoh was considered a god. So he had absolutely no interest in the God of Israel, because that was competition. Exodus 5:1. Moshe and Aharon, their brothers, they came and said to Pharaoh, "Here is what Adonai, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they can celebrate a festival in the desert to honor me." He's already planning a festival. He's already got it planned. There's going to be a big party. Exodus 7:1-2. Adonai said to Moshe, I have put you in the place of God to Pharaoh, and Aharon, your brother, will be your prophet. You are to say everything I order you, and Aharon, your brother, is to speak to Pharaoh and tell him to let the people of Israel leave his land. Notice, it is God who creates the message. The prophet is merely called to deliver it. Prophets don't make up their own messages. Prophets deliver what he, the Father, says to deliver. Exodus 7:3-6. Even though I will increase my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies, my people, the sons of Israel, out of the land of Egypt with great acts of judgment. Then when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring the people of Israel out from among them, the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai. Moshe and Aharon did exactly what Adonai ordered them to do. Moshe was 80 years old and Aharon 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. Again, we are never too old for our best assignment from God. Do not ever diminish that. Exodus 12:12. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. I am Adonai. Now, do you remember that law, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? It's about the punishment fitting the crime. It's not about making revenge, but it's that the punishment that is executed must match the crime in intensity. Okay? So let's take a look at how that plays out. Exodus 1:15-17. Moreover, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, whenever you attend the Hebrew women and see them giving birth, if it's a boy, kill him. Remember, this is what happened. That's why Moshe didn't get killed, because he was pulled out of the river. But this is the reminder. The Pharaoh said, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. However, the midwives were God-fearing women, so they didn't do as the king of Egypt ordered them and let the boys live. Well, that didn't work, so Pharaoh tried it again. Exodus 1:22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every boy that is born, throw him in the river. Let all the girls live. So Moshe was one of those babies who was thrown in the river. Isn't it interesting that he was selected to be the one who would execute the judgment against Pharaoh for that very thing? Pharaoh had ordered the babies to be thrown in the Nile, so his sin came back on him. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Look at this. Exodus 7:20-21. Moshe and Aharon did exactly what Adonai ordered. He raised the staff, and in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, struck the water in the river, and all the water in the river was turned to blood. The fish in the river died. The river stank so badly that the Egyptians couldn't drink its water. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Well, this plague mocked the Egyptian gods. There was Khnum, Hapi, Hatmet, and Osiris. They were supposed to be in control of the Nile River. They weren't, were they? So that first thing that Pharaoh did, throw the babies in the river, that's the very thing that comes at him first in the plagues. The river is ruined. Second plague, Exodus 7:26 and 28 up to 29. Let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will strike all your territory with frogs. The river will swarm with frogs. They will go up, enter your palace, and into your bedroom, and in your bed. How about that? They will enter the houses of your servants and your people and go into your ovens and your kneading bowls. Can you imagine making bread with a frog in it? Ugh. The frogs will climb all over you, your people and your servants. That was a nasty plague. Exodus 8:9-10. The frogs died in their houses, in their courtyards, and their fields. They gathered them in heaps until the land stank. The Egyptians worshipped the goddess of fertility named Heqet, who had the body of a woman and the head of a frog. Frogs were treated as sacred in Egypt, and so the Egyptians wouldn't ever kill them. So all of those frogs that were in their ovens and in their beds, they had to live with them until they died. So their sacred frogs became a curse on them. Remember what God said, I am executing judgment against the gods of Egypt. Third plague, Exodus 8:12-13. Adonai said to Moshe, say to Aharon, reach out with your staff and strike the dust on the ground, and it will become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. They did it, Aaron reached out his hand with his staff. He struck the dust on the ground, and there were lice on people and animals. All the dust on the ground became lice throughout the whole land of Egypt. Can you imagine how itchy that must have been? This judgment was against the god Geb. He was their Egyptian god of the earth, who was supposed to be in charge of the dust of the earth. And it was also against the god Uatkich, who was supposed to be in charge of insects. It seems like their gods were asleep at the switch. What do you think? Judgment against the gods. Exodus 8:18-19. This is the fourth plague. If you won't let my people go, I will send swarms of insects on you, your servants, and your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of swarms of insects, likewise the ground they stand on. But I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people live. Do you remember how they got to the land of Goshen? Because the Pharaoh that was there before brought Joseph's family to the land of Goshen. And he said, this is prime real estate I'm giving you. So you see how God protected his people, put them in the best real estate. And it says, I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people live. No swarms of insects will be there, so that you can realize that I am Adonai right here in the land. Yes, I will distinguish between my people and your people, and this sign will happen by tomorrow. Can you imagine what that would be like, to be walking down the street and there's swarms following you, and across the street in Goshen, there's none? Amazing. So this judgment was against Khepri. He was the Egyptian god of creation. He was in charge of the movement of the sun, and Khepri was pictured, guess what, with the head of a fly. The plague also mocked Utachik, who was the god of insects, and Beelzebub, you've heard of him, the god of the flies, and Kepra, who was pictured as a scarab beetle. So all of these judgments were against the gods of Egypt. You see what our God was doing? He was mocking those gods, saying, I'll show you. I'm sending you frogs. I'm sending you insects. I'm sending you all those things which your gods are supposed to control. We'll see if they really can. Exodus 9, 1-6, fifth plague. Let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse to let them go and persist in holding on to them, the hand of Adonai is on your livestock in the field, on the horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and flocks, and will make them suffer a devastating illness. But Adonai will distinguish between Egypt's and Israel's livestock. Nothing belonging to the people of Israel will die. That's pretty good protection. The following day, Adonai did it. All the livestock of Egypt died, but not one of the animals belonging to the people of Israel died. Wonderful protection. It pays to know people in high places. The Egyptians worshipped livestock. So this plague brought death to their livestock. The plague mocked the god of cattle, who was Ptah, and the protectress of the cows, Hathor, who was depicted with the head of a cow. That was supposed to be their domain, to protect the livestock. They were not taking care of things, were they? They could not be a match for the Creator. Sixth plague, Exodus 9, 8-9. Adonai said to Moshe and Aharon, take handfuls of ashes from a kiln and let Moshe throw them in the air before Pharaoh's eyes. They will turn into fine dust all over the land of Egypt and become infected sores on men and animals throughout Egypt. So they took the ashes from a kiln, stood in front of Pharaoh, and threw them in the air. They became infected sores on the men and the animals. Now, what you might not know is there was an Egyptian custom to scatter the ashes of dead animals over the land as a sign of blessings from the gods. That was what they did, throwing the ashes. This action that was supposed to bring blessings brought a curse, mocking the god of medicine, Imhotep, and Isis, the goddess of epidemics. And Sekhmet, right? Never heard of Sekhmet, but anyway, these were all the gods that were supposed to be in charge of these things. They weren't doing their job, were they? Seventh plague, Exodus 9:23-26. Moshe reached out with his staff toward the sky, and Adonai sent thunder and hail, and fire ran down to the earth. Adonai caused it to hail on the land of Egypt. It hailed, and fire flashed up with the hail. It was terrible, worse than any hailstorm in all of Egypt since it became a nation. Throughout all the land of Egypt, the hail struck everything in the field, people and animals, and every plant growing in the field, and broke every tree there. But in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were, there was no hail. Exodus 9:31-32. The flax and the barley were ruined, because the barley was ripe and the flax in bud. But the wheat and buckwheat were not ruined, because they come up later. Now, that seems like an odd thing to just throw into the middle of this passage, but every passage that's in the scripture is important. What we know about flax is it's harvested in the late winter. And then there's a winter barley that's planted in the winter and then harvested in the early spring. So this passage in the scripture tells us when this was taking place. It was late winter, early spring. Okay, the seventh plague of thunder and hail destroyed the flax and the barley crops. This was a direct attack upon their God, who was supposed to protect the crops. He was called Min. They had the god of agriculture, Seth, and they had a goddess of the sky named Nut. They weren't working that day. They were on vacation. Eighth plague, Exodus 10:13-15. Moshe reached out with his staff over the land of Egypt, and Adonai caused an east wind to blow on the land all day and all night. And in the morning the east wind brought the locusts. The locusts went up over all the land of Egypt and settled throughout Egypt's territory. It was an invasion more severe than there had ever been before or will ever be again. They completely covered the ground so that the ground looked black. They ate every plant growing from the ground and all the fruit of the trees left by the hail. Not one green thing remained, not a tree, not a plant in the field in all the land of Egypt. So guess what? This is a mockery against Seth. He's supposed to be in charge of agriculture and storms and disorder. And it was a mockery of every one of the gods who was in charge of each of the specific crops. That was a lot of gods that were being mocked that day. And they didn't come to the rescue of the Egyptians. Ninth plague, Exodus 10:21-23. Adonai said to Moshe, reach out your hand toward the sky, and there will be darkness over the land of Egypt, darkness so thick it can be felt. Moshe reached out his hand toward the sky, and there was a thick darkness in the entire land of Egypt for 3 days. People couldn't see each other, and no one went anywhere for 3 days. But all the people of Israel had light in their homes. This was a mockery of their god Ra, the sun god, and Atum, who was the god of the setting sun. They had a god for everything. But they did not come to rescue the Egyptians. But in the land of Goshen, they had light. 10th plague, Exodus 12, 1-7. Adonai spoke to Moshe and Aharon in the land of Egypt, and he said, "You are to begin your calendar with this month. It will be the first month of the year for you." Now do you understand why it was necessary for us to know about the flax and the barley? Because it told us what this season was when God declared, this month is going to be the beginning of all months for you. It was the spring, after the spring equinox. Okay? He says, you're going to begin your calendar with this month. Well, before, they used to start their calendar in the fall. Now, he's changing it. We're going to start counting the months in the spring. Speak to all the assembly of Israel and say, on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb or kid for his family, one per household, except that if the household is too small for a whole lamb or kid, then he and his next-door neighbor should share one, dividing it in proportion to the number of people eating it. Your animal must be without defect, a male in its first year, and you may choose it from either the sheep or the goats. He's giving some very, very specific guidelines for them to get ready because the plague is coming and it's going to impact them. I want to explain something called the threshold covenant. The threshold covenant was a common practice in Egypt. The leader of the house would sacrifice an animal outside the house. They would splatter the animal's blood on the threshold and on the doorposts of their houses. This was a sign that the family extended a blood covenant of friendship to their guests, and their guests would be welcome in that house and they would be safe inside. This was a common practice, the threshold covenant. So notice in Exodus 12 what he says, you are to keep it until the 14th day of the month, the lamb, and then the entire assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter it at dusk. They are to take some of the blood and smear it on the two sides and the top of the door frame at the entrance of the house in which they eat. Now, if from that culture they understood what he was saying, oh, this is a covenant, it's a friendship covenant with God. We're going to splatter the blood on our houses, and it is a sign between him and us. He is telling us that we are going to be safe inside this house. Exodus 12, 8-13. That night, they are to eat the meat. This is Moshe still giving instructions. That night, they are to eat the meat roasted in fire. They are to eat it with matzah and maror. Matzah is unleavened bread. It has not risen with yeast. Maror is bitter herbs. Don't eat it raw or boiled, but roast it in the fire with its head and the lower parts of its legs and its inner organs. Let nothing of it remain till morning. If any of it does remain, burn it up completely. Here is how you are to eat it, with your belt fastened, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in hand. In other words, be dressed to run, because you're going to get a signal and you're going to leave, okay? He says, you are to eat it hurriedly. It is Adonai's Pesach. Pesach means Passover. For that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and kill all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both men and animals, and I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. So they're going to get it again, more judgment against them. I am Adonai. The blood will serve you as a sign, marking the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. When I strike the land of Egypt, the death blow will not strike you. So what do we know from this? The blood saved them. The blood of the Lamb save them. Now, here they are getting their instructions from Moshe. And they're being told, get ready to run, because it's going to be a quick signal and you've got to get out of town. You've got to follow me. But before they even leave, he gives them this instruction about a festival that's coming. He tells them before they've ever even had the Passover experience, he's telling them these instructions. This will be a day for you to remember and celebrate as a festival to Adonai. From generation to generation, you are to celebrate it by a perpetual regulation. What is perpetual? Everlasting, ongoing, year after year. It's not going to stop. Every year, celebrate this. Remember this. Okay? This is a big deal to God. It's a big deal. So he says, for 7 days, you are to eat matzah. On the first day, remove the leaven from your houses. For whoever eats hametz, which is leavened bread, from the first to the 7th day is to be cut off from Israel. That's a serious thing. On the 1st and 7th days, you are to have an assembly set aside for God. On these days, no work is to be done except what each must do to prepare his food. You may do only that. Only prepare your food. Okay? You are to observe the festival of matzah, for on this very day I brought your divisions out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, you are to observe this day, he says it again, from generation to generation by a perpetual regulation. Perpetual regulation. So he talks about this as the festival of matzah. We call it the Passover. Aren't they kind of related? The Passover happens first and then the festival, the celebration. So we have the festival of matzah, 7 days. It's always including a meal with roasted lamb. Exodus 12, 18 to 20. From the evening of the 14th day of the first month until the evening of the 21st day, you are to eat matzah. He's pretty clear about when we're supposed to do it, right? We know when we're supposed to do it because we're supposed to be keeping track of the new moon. And when we know when the new moon is, we count from there. Okay, that was the first day. I can count up to 14 days and figure out where that is. So he tells us the evening of the 14th day of the first month until the evening of the 21st day, you are to eat matzah. It's pretty clear. During those 7 days, no leaven is to be found in your houses. That means anything that causes the bread to rise. That's yeast, baking soda, that sort of thing, okay? Whoever eats food with hametz in it is to be cut off from the community of Israel. It doesn't matter whether he is a foreigner or a citizen of the land. Eat nothing with hametz in it. Wherever you live, eat matzah. Did you see what he just said? He's talking to the Hebrews. They're going to be escaping. And he says it doesn't matter whether it's a foreigner or a citizen of the land. Everybody's supposed to abide by this. Everybody. Exodus 12, 21 to 24. Then Moshe called for all the leaders of Israel and said, select and take lambs for your families and slaughter the Pesach lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop leaves and dip it in the blood which is in the basin and smear it on the 2 sides and the top of the door frame. Remember the threshold covenant. Then none of you is to go out the door of his house until morning, for Adonai will pass through to kill the Egyptians, but when he sees the blood on the top and the 2 sides, Adonai will pass over the door and will not allow the slaughterer to enter your houses and kill you. You are to observe this as a law, you and your descendants, for how long? Forever. What day? Nisan 14 at dusk. Here's the other commandment. This is before they've even escaped yet. He's giving all the orders. Exodus 12, 25 to 28. When you come to the land which Adonai will give you as he has promised, you are to observe this ceremony. When your children ask you, what do you mean by this ceremony? You say, it is the sacrifice of Adonai's Pesach, because Adonai passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he killed the Egyptians but spared our houses. The people of Israel bowed their heads and worshipped. And then the people of Israel went and did as Adonai had ordered Moshe and Aharon. This is what they did. You see, all that I've read so far, these are just the instructions. So when the plan was put in motion that they were going to be escaping Egypt, when he told them to slaughter the lamb, when he told them to put the blood on the doorposts, that was all preparation for that night. But he was telling them, you're going to be celebrating this. This is going to be a celebration every year. Don't forget. You will never forget. I don't want you to forget that you are saved by the blood of the Lamb. Exodus 12, 29 to 30. Okay, now it's happening. At midnight, Adonai killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, sitting on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. Pharaoh got up in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians. And there was horrendous wailing in Egypt, for there wasn't a single house without someone dead in it. So this 10th plague was a judgment against Pharaoh. He was the ultimate god, the power of Egypt. They believed he was the greatest god of all. Even he had his son struck down. And by the way, that was King Tut. That's who his son was. Moshe had been forewarned. Exodus 4, 21 to 23. Remember, this is what he had been told. You are to tell Pharaoh, Adonai says, Israel is my firstborn. I've told you to let my son go in order to worship me, but you have refused to let him go. Well then, I will kill your firstborn son. This was the very first thing he had told Moshe before he and Aharon had ever set foot before Pharaoh and given any instructions whatsoever. He was told, your firstborn son is going to be killed. Exodus 12, 31 to 36. He summoned Moshe and Aharon by night and said, up and leave my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go. Serve Adonai as you said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you said, and get out of here. Who's talking now? Pharaoh, get out of here. Take your flocks, take your herds, get out. And then he says, but bless me too. What a funny thing to say. Well, bless me while you're going. The Egyptians pressed to send the people out of the land quickly because they said, otherwise we'll all be dead. So they needed to get them out because everybody's going to be dying. Get these guys out of here. They're the cause of it. So the people took their dough before it had become leavened, wrapped it in their kneading bowls, in their clothes, on their shoulders. The people of Israel had done what Moshe had said. They had asked the Egyptians to give them silver and gold jewelry and clothing. And Adonai had made the Egyptians so favorably disposed toward the people that they let them have whatever they requested. And thus, they plundered the Egyptians. Wasn't that what Abraham was told? Your descendants will be slaves for 400 years, but they will leave with much wealth. much wealth. 430 years, right? That's what he was told. Exodus 12, 37 to 42. The people of Israel traveled from Ramses to Sukkot, from 600,000 men on foot, some 600,000 men on foot, not counting the children. Okay, let's figure we've got wives in there too. And if they only had one child, you've got to triple that number. 600,000, so that's 1,800,000. That's the smallest amount, okay? A mixed crowd went with them. Wait a minute, who's this mixed crowd? There were a few Egyptians who snuck in the crowd. They said, we're going after the God of Israel. We don't need this God of Pharaoh anymore. He's a loser. So they snuck into the crowd. The mixed crowd went with them, as well as livestock in large numbers, both flocks and herds. Remember, the Egyptians said, take whatever you want, just get out. So they got the flocks, they got the herds, they baked matzah loaves with the dough that they had brought from Egypt, since it was unleavened, because they had been driven out of Egypt without the time to prepare supplies for themselves. The time the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. It's exactly what Abraham was told. At the end of 430 years, to the day, all the divisions of Adonai left the land of Egypt. This was a night when Adonai kept vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. I love this next part. And this same night continues to be a night when Adonai keeps vigil for all the people of Israel throughout all generations. Throughout all generations. Genesis 15, 13 to 16. Adonai knew exactly what he was talking about. He told ahead of time exactly what would happen. Adonai had said to Avram, know this for certain, your descendants will be foreigners in a land that is not theirs. They will be slaves and held in oppression there 400 years. But I will also judge that nation, the one that makes them slaves. Afterward, they will leave with many possessions. And then that next verse in Exodus 12, the time the people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years to the day, all the divisions of Adonai left the land of Egypt. So why is there a discrepancy between 430 and 400? Here's your answer. 30 years they were in Egypt as free men. They were living under Joseph's leadership. 400 years in Egypt, they were slaves under the next Pharaoh. And that's our 430 years. So how are we supposed to celebrate? Exodus 13. Remember this day on which you left Egypt. Remember it. That's the first way to celebrate. Do not eat hametz, nothing with yeast, no fluffy cakes, no bread that's risen, sorry. For 7 days you are to eat matzah. The seventh day is to be a festival for Adonai. Matzah is to be eaten throughout the 7 days. Neither hametz nor leavening agents are to be seen with you throughout your territory. On that day, tell your son, it is because of what Adonai did for me when I left Egypt. More instruction in Leviticus 23, 5 to 8. For 7 days, eat matzah. On the first day, have a holy convocation. That means have a party. Get together with your friends. Don't do any kind of ordinary work. Bring an offering for 7 days. On the seventh day is a holy convocation. Do not do any kind of ordinary work. So what do we know about this? We are to gather only with believers. This is not a celebration for unbelievers. This is for believers. Eat roasted lamb, matzah, and bitter herbs. So when is Passover? Well, it's pretty clear in the scripture. Numbers 9, 2 to 3 says, observe Pesach at its designated time, on the 14th day of this month at dusk. Now, did you know that if you missed it because of certain things that caused you to miss it, He gives you a second chance. This is the only festival that has a second chance. Why? Because it's about the blood of the Lamb, and he doesn't want anybody to miss it. So let's look at our second chance, Numbers 9, 10 to 12. Tell the people of Israel, if any of you now or in the future generations is unclean because of a corpse, or if he's on a trip abroad, nevertheless he is to observe Pesach. But he will observe it in the second month, on the 14th day at dusk. They are to eat it with matzah and maror. It's all the same, it's just 1 month later. Second chance Passover. That's what it is. It's called Pesach Sheni. Sheni means second. But the person who is clean and not on a trip, who fails to observe Pesach, will be cut off from his people. Not because God cuts him off, but because he cuts himself off from his people, because he didn't celebrate, because he did not bring the offering for Adonai at its designated time. That person will bear the consequences of his sin. So the gathering together of the believers is to celebrate, to remember, to have the feast, but also to bring an offering to the Lord. And that's part of this whole thing. He says, remember and do these steps. This is what blesses you. Exodus 13. Now, they're on their journey of escape. And it says, God led the people through the desert by the Sea of Suf. They traveled from Sukkot. They set up camp in the Etam at the edge of the desert. Adonai went ahead of them in a column of cloud during the daytime to lead them on their way, and at night in a column of fire to give them light. Thus they could travel both by day and by night. Neither the column of cloud by day nor the column of fire at night went away from in front of the people. He was ever present, and it was obvious. He was present with them. Imagine you're in the desert. Hey, there's no lights in the desert, no electricity, right? So when they're traveling, he provides the light at night, the fire. He provides a cloud during the day. That cloud is like air conditioning, keeps them from the heat in the desert, right? And the fire at night to keep them warm. Isn't that amazing how he did that? So he let his presence be known, and he was always steps ahead of them to show them where they were headed. Well, Pharaoh didn't have that help. Remember, all of his gods were struck down, so he didn't have any help from his gods. Exodus 14, 5 to 9. Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people. Wait a minute, we don't want them to go. Those were our slaves. What are we going to do when our workforce leaves? So he changes his mind. So he prepared his chariots, took his people with them, 600 first-quality chariots, as well as all the other chariots in Egypt, along with their commanders. So it's more than 600. 600 is just the top quality ones, and then all the rest of the chariots. The Egyptians went after them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh with his cavalry and army, and overtook them as they were encamped by the sea, by Pi Hahirot, in front of Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and saw the Egyptians right there, coming after them. In great fear, the people of Israel cried out to Adonai. Wait a minute, they have this cloud and they have the fire, and they're crying out. They can see that he's there, and they're still crying out. What happened to faith? They didn't have so much, right? In great fear, they cried out. Exodus 14, 13 to 14. Moshe answered the people, "Stop being so fearful. Remain steady. You will see how Adonai is going to save you. He will do it today. Today you have seen the Egyptians, but you will never see them again. Adonai will do battle for you. Just calm yourselves down. You will never see them again. This is it. I'm winning this battle for you. You're not going to see the enemy, even though he's right at your doorstep right now. I'm going to knock him down. Exodus 14, 19 to 20. Next, the angel of God who was going ahead of the camp of Israel moved away and went behind them. And the column of cloud moved away from in front of them and stood behind them. Can you imagine? The cloud just jumps over and goes and puts itself between them as a barrier. And Pharaoh and his army, they're probably freaking out. The cloud just jumped in between us. We can't get past that cloud. Watch what it says. Moved in front of them, and it stood then behind them. It stationed itself between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. There was a cloud and darkness here, but light by night there, so that no one, let me read that again, so that the one did not come near the other all night long. There's a cloud in the way. A big cloud. It must be a very big cloud. Exodus 14, 21 to 25. Moshe reached his hand out over the sea, and Adonai caused the sea to go back before a strong east wind all night. He made the sea become dry land, and its water was divided in two. Then the people of Israel went into the sea on the dry ground, with the water walled up for them on their right and on their left. Can you imagine that? The water just swooped up and made walls. And now they've got a path they can go right through the walls. The Egyptians continued their pursuit, going after them into the sea. I don't know, if I was an Egyptian, I'd be a little afraid of those walls. But I guess they thought it was their gods doing it for them. All of the Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and cavalry went right into the sea. Just before dawn, Adonai looked out on the Egyptian army through the column of fire and cloud and threw them into a panic. He caused the wheels of their chariots to break off so that they could move only with difficulty. The Egyptians said, Adonai is fighting for Israel against the Egyptians. Let's get away from them. Well, do you know that, I can't remember if it's 20 years ago, I'm not sure of the date, but a man named Ron Wyatt and his sons were deep sea diving in this area. They found the broken chariot wheels. And there are YouTube videos where you can look that up, and they'll show you the pictures of what they saw. The chariot wheels were there, broken in that area. They're still there. Exodus 14, 26 to 29. Adonai said to Moshe, reach your hand out over the sea, and the water will return and cover the Egyptians with their chariots and cavalry. Moshe reached his hand out over the sea, and by dawn the sea had returned to its former depth. The Egyptians tried to flee, but Adonai swept them into the sea. The water came back and covered all the chariots and cavalry of Pharaoh's army who had followed them into the sea. Not even one of them was left. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the sea, with the water walled up for them on their right and on their left. Does that sound like deliverance to you? That was on the third day of their journey. Let's think about this for a minute. Passover, the blood of the Lamb. 3 days later, they get victory. Doesn't that kind of sound like Yeshua in the tomb, and on the third day is victory? It sure does. It sure does. So let's summarize what we talked about. Pesach lambs were selected on the 10th of Nisan. The Pesach lambs were slaughtered on the 14th of Nisan at dusk. It was a specific time. Pesach lambs were eaten on the evening of Nisan 15 with matzah and maror. Then here's our instructions now. Eat matzah for 7 days. Avoid hametz. Eat roasted lamb and bitter herbs. Bring a Passover offering. Teach the children the story of deliverance by the blood of the lamb. And for us, we need to remember Pesach is a mandated annual celebration, but it's only for believers. Pesach is the only feast of all of the biblical feasts that provides us a second chance to celebrate. What are our lessons for Passover? Well, first of all, Moshe foreshadows Yeshua. He had been a prince in the Pharaoh's palace. Then he was a shepherd. Then he was a deliverer. Yeshua is the Prince of Peace, the Good Shepherd, and the mighty deliverer. Moshe was a Hebrew living in a foreign land. Yeshua came down from heaven to live among people as a foreigner. Moshe led the Hebrew slaves to freedom from Pharaoh's oppression. Yeshua leads us to bring freedom from bondage of Satan and sin. He leads us. He brings us that freedom. Celebrating the Passover is for believers only. It is a foreshadowing of the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is for believers only. And we'll be in a few minutes going on to part 3, Yeshua the Lamb. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break.